We are hosting a panel discussion about cannabis and next steps for Vermont, but more importantly, conversations from our neighbors, particularly from Maine. We have Erik Gunderson here, who I will give a full bio from Maine to my left, and Kevin Conroy from Massachusetts, and Charlotte Hanna from Massachusetts as well as some notable Vermonters. Joe Bergeron is here, as well as David Mickenberg and Laura Subin. I just want to say a few words about why we're having this conversation. I think Vermont is in a really weird position when it comes to cannabis. In fact, I think we're probably in the worst position we can possibly be in, where we've legalized possession of cannabis, but we've remained absolutely silent on how Vermonters obtain it. That's not good for consumer protection. It's not good for public health. It's not good from law enforcement. We dealt with this issue of gifting about a year ago, where people were saying, hey, buy a t-shirt and we'll give you a gift of cannabis. That doesn't work for anybody. So we need transparency, we need legitimacy, and we need a regulated marketplace in this area, in this state now. Our neighbors have done it in Massachusetts, our neighbors have done it in Maine. And we're going to hear about the challenges from those states, what's worked and what hasn't worked, and some lessons perhaps we can learn as the legislature convenes in January. I'm sure that this issue will come up. I know that Representative Maida Townsend is here from South Burlington. Representative Joey Donovan from Burlington is here, and I think others would come. I know that former representative and Judge Ben Joseph is here. Judge Joseph and I are good friends. We happen to disagree on this issue. And I want to note that there are strong opinions about legalization, and there are many people like Judge Joseph, who I have enormous respect for, who opposes legalization. I think we have a debate and a disagreement about whether or not you can put the genie back in the bottle when we've already legalized possession, but I'm sure that Judge Joseph will say a few words later. So this is what the night's going to look like. We'll have a conversation that I will moderate. At some point in time, I will invite questions from the audience, and hopefully we can just have a conversation. So with that, let me give a brief introduction of our panelists. To my left is Erik Gunderson. He is the director of the Maine Office of Marijuana Policy within the Department of Administrative and Financial Services. At the Office of Marijuana Policy, Erik oversees a newly created agency of state government that is responsible for all aspects of licensing, regulation, and oversight of Maine's medical use of marijuana and adult use marijuana programs. In his role as director, Erik is responsible for the rollout and establishment of Maine's adult use program. Since February of 2019, he and his staff have been working to develop the administrative rules required by the Marijuana Legalization Act, hire a vendor responsible for the tracking and tracing of marijuana plants and products in Maine, and deploy a licensing system. Erik, thanks for being here tonight. We appreciate it. Next to Erik is Kevin Conroy, who is a partner in the law firm of Foley, Hoag in Boston, Massachusetts, with a primary focus on government investigations and regulatory matters. He co-chairs the firm's Cannabis and Energy and Clean Tech and the State Attorney General Group. Kevin advises a variety of cannabis investors and operators across the United States regarding compliance with state and local cannabis laws and regulations. He has helped clients secure cannabis license in multiple states and has worked with clients to obtain state approval for changes of ownership as part of multi-state and international transaction. He previously served as a Massachusetts Deputy Attorney General. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Charlotte Hanna is an entrepreneur and founder of the Massachusetts-based Community Growth Partners, which is launching Rebel, a new cannabis social impact brand. Charlotte just successfully licensed 3 new cannabis operations in Massachusetts and closed her first round of debt financing. Her first store will open in the Berkshires in early 2020, and her team will begin cultivating and manufacturing products later in Northampton, Massachusetts. Charlotte has nearly 30 years of experience in multinational corporations, real estate, and other ventures. Since 2012, she has invested in undervalued real estate and development projects. Previously, she worked for over 11 years at Goldman Sachs, holding various positions within the firm's training and organizational development group, helping to build the workforce and structures the company needed as it evolved and grew. Charlotte, thank you for coming to Vermont. Joe Bergeron is the president of the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. He has led that organization since 1979 and is the primary point of contact in the areas of legislative advocacy, regulatory compliance, legal human services, IT, and management. Joe is a member of the board of directors of the Credit Union National Association and currently serves on the board of Tri-Corp Federal Corp Unions. He also currently serves on the board of the National Cooperative Business Association, along with numerous committees for credit unions and cooperative interests at both the state and national level. Joe, thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Laura Subin is the director of the Vermont Coalition to Regulate Marijuana and has led the organization since it was founded in 2014. Laura has engaged extensively with a wide variety of stakeholders regarding Vermont's cannabis policy. She regularly speaks publicly on cannabis policy issues and has been invited to testify on the subject before the Vermont legislature on a number of occasions. She was appointed a member on the Tax and Regulate Subcommittee of the Vermont Governor's Marijuana Advisory Commission. As an attorney, she also directs the Pennywise Foundation. In that capacity and others, she has been active in the criminal legal system reform advocacy for many years and has been recognized as an expert in domestic violence by courts in Vermont and New York. Laura, thanks for being here. Finally, David Mickenberg is a partner at the Burlington law firm Mickenberg, Dunn & Smith. At the firm, David focuses on civil litigation, workers' compensation, and public affairs. Prior to joining the firm, David served as a Dorat Fellow at Washington, D.C. at the Alliance for Justice, working on research and advocacy related to presidential appointees to the federal judiciary, including 3 Supreme Court nominations. Prior to law school, David spent 6 years at 2 programs started by George Soros' Open Society Institute, the Drug Policy Alliance, and the After School Corporation, working on policy, communications, and government relations. Dave, thanks for being here. So I want to start the conversation with Charlotte. We spoke the other day, Charlotte. You have an incredible background in business. You've worked in real estate in arguably the most difficult real estate market in the world, New York City. You've worked in the financial industry at Goldman Sachs. You worked and developed sustainable agriculture products while in San Francisco. But when we were talking on the phone the other day, you said to me, entering this market, the cannabis market in Massachusetts, quote, has been the most difficult thing you've ever done. I want to know why. Why has this been so difficult with somebody with your business experience, somebody who has engaged in difficult marketplaces in the past? What is different about this market?
I think that, if I could just sum it up in a couple of points, I think the way the regulations were designed in Massachusetts were very well-intentioned, sort of trying to push the responsibility down to the municipalities out of respect for the change that was afoot in these communities that were going to be welcoming cannabis. But what happened as a result of that was that it became very difficult to figure out where to go. A lot of municipalities banned it. And so I had to sort of, as someone not from the state actually, first decide, well, which town am I going to go to? What has the friendliest government that is, the most pro-business, pro-cannabis? And then I fast realized that real estate, the way that they had regulated out of respect to the municipalities, the first step that you had to take in Massachusetts was to identify and secure real estate and prove it to the state that you had some real estate under control and that the community, within a half a mile or whatever the buffer zone was around that real estate, came to a public meeting and voiced their concerns. And so it was a very decentralized sort of grassroots sort of mobilizing that you had to do of people around your real estate. But what happened as a result of that was that you had to then I had to start going through the regulatory process with the state, with the Cannabis Commission, which took a very long time. And through that process, you're carrying, very expensive real estate for a long time. And, this became apparent to property owners in all these municipalities that if you were in the zone where cannabis was going to be allowed, suddenly you had a valuable asset on your hands, and prices went up. You had to, and there was an interesting intersection with opportunity zones, which is a federal program to get investment into communities that have been hurt, economically. And so a lot of people started looking in these, at the intersection of opportunity zones and cannabis zones. So I was bidding on properties and that were $300,000 the year before were suddenly $2 million because the property owners realized that they had an asset. So it required, a lot of capital. And the second part to what has been very difficult about this is the lack of liquidity. I'm used to, as a real estate investor, going to a bank and borrowing or having a line of credit against some asset. There's no liquidity available for this industry. There is liquidity, but I'm going to call it usury, 20, 30% rates if you want to borrow from private sources. And, recently there's been a little bit of a bubble in the cannabis market from an investment perspective, and equity, capital has really dried up. So it's become very difficult to get access to capital. So you have this interesting dynamic where people are in control of assets that you need in order to proceed, and you don't have access to capital. It's very difficult to get capital. So it required me to be incredibly creative and I'm used to taking risk. I take risk for a living, but to take a lot more personal risk than I had ever taken before. And so that is, if I could give any advice and input as a small business, I am a small business owner. It's just me and a few people working with me, and to really think about the small business and those kinds of challenges because of where we are with the federal laws and the lack of banking opportunities for people. I have a lot of, we can get to recommendations, but that would be sort of why it has been very difficult, because of the way the regulations were designed to make real estate the very first important step, and the lack of liquidity, to make that happen.
Thank you. Kevin, let me go to you. Give us the thumbnail sketch of the Massachusetts regulatory system. What does it look like? How did you guys get there? And I want to follow up on one of the things that Charlotte said about lack of access to capital, which I would translate as lack of entry for folks who don't have capital. Have the mass rules kept people out who don't have access to capital? But regulatory framework and some of the problems you've seen with Massachusetts thus far.
First, I just want to thank you, General, for having me here. I feel a bit conflicted being here. I was speaking to one of our clients who's got a dispensary, and his dispensary happens to be somewhat near the Vermont border, and I said to him, "What do you? I'm going up to Vermont. What should I talk about?" And he said, "You got to lie." I said, "What?" I said, "It's the Attorney General is doing this presentation. I can't lie at a presentation from the Attorney General." He said, "No, you got to lie." He said, "You got to say that we are selling to kids. You got to say that it's led to increased crime." He said, you've got to say all of those bad things that are going on. I said, "I can't say that. None of that's going on in Massachusetts. I can't say that." He said, "You have to." And I said, what are you talking about? He said, "Do you know how many people drive across the Vermont border who come to Massachusetts and buy product and come back to Vermont?" I said, "Well, okay. So if you hear some bad things out of me tonight, it's largely because I'm trying to protect my clients. But for the most part, things are going very, very well in Massachusetts." And I'll give you a quick regulatory overview. We passed an adult use referendum in 2016. We today have 35 dispensaries in Massachusetts, kind of spread across the state. Some are near state borders because we have so many people coming to the state because of cannabis now. We're going to do about $600 million in cannabis sales in Massachusetts next year. That we have a 20% tax in Massachusetts, and so that's about $125 million.
Is that money earmarked anywhere in the state?
That is not earmarked. That money goes back to the general fund and is used. Our Cannabis Control Commission is about has a budget about $7.5 million, and so this has been a real moneymaker for Massachusetts. Now, we are the first adult use state on the East Coast. Again, we get a fair number of people from out of state who come to Massachusetts just because of this. Just a couple of lessons that we have learned in Massachusetts, and we'll talk a lot more about this. One is we have this very strong local control in Massachusetts for our cannabis businesses. Charlotte and all of our cannabis businesses, to get up and running, have to go to their municipality and have to get an agreement from that municipality in order to even go through the licensing process. Part of that process of giving that agreement is that Charlotte is going to have to pay 3% of her revenues to the local town. That's too much local. We gave too much control to our municipalities. And if I had some advice for Vermont, it would be you need to have some local control, but we've got too much local control in Massachusetts. The second thing I would say is we have struggled some with diversity in our ownership. And Charlotte talked about this is a very expensive business to open. We are making efforts at diversity. There are some well-intentioned, our regulators are very well-intentioned on this issue. But one of the things we found is that we need better state loans. We need better state funding going to help small business owners open these businesses. And we're getting better at that. You're going to see a better system soon in Massachusetts. But I think a lot about how we can ensure that you have larger businesses and smaller businesses get into your operation in Vermont. Let me talk about capital.
Yep.
So capital is a big problem. We do have 5 banks, and we'll talk more about banking, who serve this industry, but they do not provide loans to this industry. And so you are, obviously the United States stock market, these companies are not traded on. It is a tough capital environment. It's only gotten tougher over the last couple. What we find is that most of our businesses rely on small investors, family offices to fund their businesses. But that has become a challenge, and it is a real challenge for folks who aren't in the normal capital challenges. I mean, Charlotte's somebody who worked at Goldman Sachs, has a very, very good network. It's challenging for her, but for folks who don't have those sort of networks, it is a real challenge, and it's had effects on our diversity. And that's one of the reasons that, a state like Illinois has provided specific loan programs for small business, because that's the only way you can get access to capital.
Thank you. And I want to come back, Kevin, but I want to put a pin in the regulatory framework of the state, which is the Cannabis Commission, I think a 5-member panel in Massachusetts. I think that's on the table in Vermont, but we'll hear from Dave Mickenberg on that. But the local control infrastructure, so I want to come back to that. Erik, tell us Maine's experience. Where are you today, and what's coming next?
Well, today was actually a really exciting day in Maine. We hit one of our major milestones. We actually announced and made public our applications for our cultivation, manufacturing, and retail store facilities at the very tail end of our what I'd call a staggered rollout of applications. Last month we introduced or made public applications for our IIC cards, our individual identification cards, applications for our testing facilities, and this closed loop on that. So a very exciting day. We made that commitment to make these applications public when we were established in February this year. So I'm very proud of the work that our office has done. But that's essentially where we're at right now, and it took quite a bit of work to get here.
How long?
So
When did Maine legalize recreational adult use?
people in Maine like talking about this story because we legalized the same time Massachusetts did in 2016, yet we're a little bit behind. I don't want to talk too much about the history, but after we passed in 2016, the administration was hesitant to kind of work with what they were given. The legislature,
I want to ask this question. Public referendum vote or legislative vote?
Sorry, public referendum
Okay.
vote. Yep. And the legislature took over essentially the bill that was passed at the polls and spent nearly a year and a half rewriting it. to make sure that they got it to the way they wanted it. A couple governor's vetoes. So people in Maine have been waiting a really long time for this. But I like to start our timeline from February of this year when the new Mills administration established my office in February. And since then, we have been working what I would consider to be at breakneck speed to get this up and running, understanding that people have been waiting a long time. A lot of that money has been sitting out there. People have made investments in real estate. So we've been working quickly, but it's also...
Does Maine require the real estate as Massachusetts does?
It doesn't. Nope.
Okay.
We're set up a little bit different. If we want to start talking about the local control piece, we do have that in Maine. We have an opt-in program, so in order for a municipality to take part in the program, they need to opt into the program. And as of right now, I think it's only 25 or 26 towns out of the 450 some odd towns in Maine have actually taken that step. I understand the policy concerns. In my past life as a policy advisor, I would have more stronger thoughts on that, but as a regulator, I'm here to do what I've been given. But I lost track. What was I talking about? Where was I? 26 towns have opted in. But to go back, when we were established, it's, again, working at breakneck speed. So we had a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. We had to put together our rules and regulations that were really set up the framework of what the program was going to look like. In Maine, those regs are what we call major substantive, meaning that the legislature has to actually sign off on them, give them their blessing before they can be implemented. In Maine, we have a part-time legislature. So we were established in February. We had our first draft of about 80 pages of regulations to set up the infrastructure, the bare bones regulatory structure in about 6 weeks. We went through intense internal and external stakeholder engagement. And then in June, luckily enough, we got it in front of the legislature and it was passed. And since then, my office has been working to essentially operationalize all those regulations. Have
you guys set a tax? Massachusetts, you heard 20%. Where's Maine?
Yep, Maine, the effective rate is 20% as well. We have a 10% excise tax at the point of cultivation and then a 10% sales tax.
Okay, and is that money going to be earmarked to prevention, to education, or not?
So 12% comes off the top of the excise tax and goes into what we call our Public Health and Safety Fund, which is a 50-50 divide between like public education and public awareness, and then law enforcement training. So those are two programs that we're currently developing.
Thank you.
Yep.
Joe Bergeron, you've just heard three folks talk about emerging markets in Massachusetts and Maine. As the banker on the panel, and given the uncertainty and the lack of clarity at the federal level, how would you advise somebody? You heard about the need for capital and the lack of access to capital. Do you see clarity coming on this banking issue anytime soon? What is the current status?
It's a real challenge for financial institutions, be it a cooperatively owned credit union or a bank of any sort, to make the decision to provide financial services to cannabis-related businesses like Charlotte's or anybody else, others. And it's because of the inherent risk involved, and that's not to infer that the kind of business that Charlotte is starting up is risky. It's the risk of, as you referenced, TJ, the conflict between current federal law and state law, where it's been legalized to some degree. So there are credit unions in the states where it's been legalized that have done their research, and some of them chosen to provide services to cannabis-related businesses, but usually it's pretty limited. And the reason for that is this. I need to give you a little bit of a background to help everyone understand why it's a problem for financial service providers. And that's that in Vermont, for example, let's limit our scope to there. All credit unions in Vermont are either are chartered either under federal law or under state law. But either way, they are federally insured. And and that federal insurance is what insures all the deposits that all of us have as consumers in those financial institutions, be it a bank in Vermont or a cooperatively owned credit union. And so if you are in a state like Vermont, Massachusetts, or Maine, where cannabis business is legal to some degree, and you want to provide service, you are doing it at the risk of potentially, it hasn't happened yet to anyone, but potentially losing your federal deposit insurance coverage. And if you lose that federal and deposit insurance coverage, you can't do business. You're out of business. And so the federal government, because it's an illegal substance still, has not offered any clarification as of yet. There's been minimal guidance to financial institutions that want to get into this business, but they're having to go an awful lot further than they would in serving any other business on Church Street here. So there's a lot of federal reporting involved that they have to do, kind of CYA kind of business, and they have to know Charlotte's business. They have to interrogate her, whether it's a bank or credit union or whatever, it doesn't matter what financial institution it is, and they have to know what kind of business that is, and they have to keep on top of that to ensure to their regulator, be it state or federal, that that's a viable and legal business and it continues to be that way. And even credit unions and banks that don't serve a cannabis business at all, they still have a risk because they don't know what businesses that they might have that are doing business with some cannabis-related business. So, think somebody that provides, services to a cannabis-related business, technically under federal law, that's a financial institution technically that is aiding an illegal business under federal law. So even though no federal agency has taken away the deposit insurance of a financial institution that I'm aware of for serving cannabis-related business, I kind of liken it to getting a parking ticket. Just because you didn't get a parking ticket for illegal parking yesterday doesn't mean if you do the same thing tomorrow, you're not going to get that ticket. And so that's where we're at. So right now, in response to your question, TJ, there's legislation that passed the House in Washington and is sitting in the Senate waiting for action that provides a safe harbor for financial institutions, but it's not going anywhere currently. You did, along with 33, I think it was, other attorney generals from around the country, sign a letter in support of that to the Vermont delegation and delegations from all of those states, and we very much appreciate that. Credit unions, and I believe banks too, aren't taking a position on legalization one way or another, but they do want to serve these businesses, but in order to do so, need some clarity and some safe harbor so that they know they can do so, rightfully and without risk of losing their deposit insurance.
Thank you, Joe. I want to come back to the federal level in a second. Laura Subin, we hear a lot in the Green Mountain State about legalizing, quote, the Vermont Way. What does that mean? What does it mean for the farmer? What does it mean to perhaps the retailer here in Church Street? What does the Vermont Way mean, but with a specific focus on, I think, our history as a rural agrarian state?
Well, I think it means a lot of things, and I want to be deferential to all the farmers and small business owners that I know are sitting in the audience and have a lot of experience to draw on about doing this the Vermont way and doing farming and agriculture the Vermont way when it comes to talking about small farms and small cultivators. One of the things that we know and we have listened and that we have been in a long process of listening and learning from other states that have gone before us is that we have to be protective of small farms. Their ability to raise capital and start businesses and move from the illicit market into a regulated market is going to depend on the costs. And if it can't be economically viable for them to make those transitions, then it's not going to happen. Some of the ways that we know that we do this is to issue small tiered licenses that are different for smaller farms than for larger farms, and that an unlimited number of small licenses is going to be essential to bring people to move from the illicit market to a regulated market. In Vermont, the Vermont Way, we care about, in Vermont, when we talk about that, we care about protecting the small farms, and we care about understanding the needs of the Vermont farms, The legislative proposal that S-54, that is now sitting in the House Ways and Means Committee, that passed the Senate, is sitting in the House Ways and Means Committee, does have a number of substantial protections for small farms, which I think are really important. That legislation would create a cannabis control board and would require that cannabis control board take into consideration the needs of small farmers and make accommodations for those small farmers, and create this tiered system. Similarly, it would create a tiered system. It would require that the Cannabis Control Board create a tiered system for retailers, which I think is important also for small businesses. So that's part of looking at
So tell me a little bit more, when you say a tiered system, what does that mean? Who gets in first, who gets in second? Am I interpreting that tiered system correctly?
Yes and no. So it's tiered in terms of size. So as far as cultivators go, depending on the size of your grow operation, you would have a different type of license. So right now, the current proposal contemplates a different category for 500 square feet, and then the Cannabis Control Board may decide to make tiers of any different kinds. A lot of the other states that have gone before us have tiered systems, so that you're not making the same requirements as far as security or whatever on a tiny little farm that you would make on a great big farm. The other important piece of the current legislative proposal is that it would give priority access to small cultivators, and I think that's a really good thing. I think I'm really pleased that the legislature has listened to the fact that small farmers need to get access to the market quickly, and we need to remove as many barriers of access to the market as we can for small.
How are we defining a small cultivator?
So the legislative proposal defines it as less than 500 square feet.
Got it.
So there are differences of opinion about whether that should be 1,000 square feet but that type of size of cultivation operation. I also think that there are other key components of the Vermont Way, which was the initial question, which is about the product itself and having high quality cannabis that's tested for purity, for potency, for contaminants, for saying this is a Vermont product, we can stand up, we can be proud of it, much as has happened in Vermont with the craft beer industry. And I think people are really eager to have that happen, to have third-party testing happen, to be able to say this is a Vermont product and we stand behind our product and it's a really quality product. One other key component of the Vermont Way, I think, is again around removing barriers to access. And since we are at a panel of the Attorney General, we are a state that values restorative justice, and we believe deeply in a restorative justice model. So that means letting people that have been harmed by cannabis prohibition have access, removing the barriers of access for those people to an emerging cannabis industry. And I think that's a really important value in Vermont. It's been, other states have worked to do that. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's a really key priority to say who's been hurt most by prohibition, how do we bring those people into the market? And so that's going to mean not only supporting small businesses and minority-owned businesses and businesses that are going to pay a living wage, but also to continue ongoing criminal legal system reform. So that right now we have legalization of some amounts of cannabis, but we haven't changed the penalties going upwards from those amounts. And I think we need to continue to look at the overall drug policy and look at what that means and how it reflects Vermont values and what we believe about restorative justice.
Okay, thank you. Dave, give us the legislative history of Vermont's action on cannabis from medicinal to recreational to the current bill, but I also want you to talk about two other things. I want you to talk about hemp, and I want to talk about the conversations in the legislature with this bill about the revenue generated. Where is it going to go? Is it going to go to education, prevention, or is it just straight general fund dollars?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me. I just want to say one thing about the Vermont Way, reflecting on what Laura said. I believe, and the folks from Massachusetts can correct me, that in Massachusetts a micro license is something like 10,000 square feet or something like that, or maybe
Even smaller,
something around that.
that's five.
Or smaller.
500 square feet is going to be hard to survive in the
Right,
market at that small.
so a lot of
Yeah.
folks, so the 500 square feet limit, which has been really prioritized in this bill, is the idea is that existing farmers perhaps can take advantage of that, have it value added for their farms and continue the traditions they've had as farming in Vermont. But Vermont has sort of led the way on cannabis reform for many years, was one of the first states, if not the first state, to pass medical cannabis through our legislature. That was maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, something like that. We then went on to decriminalize low-level possession of cannabis, so it would be a civil penalty instead of a criminal penalty. And then a few years ago, we're the first state in the country through its legislature to legalize the possession and the growing of cannabis for personal use. And that's where we are right now. People are allowed to, folks in Vermont over the age of 21 are allowed to grow 2 mature plants and 4 immature plants and possess up to 1 ounce of cannabis. And it's created an interesting system. The New Yorker recently did an article about Vermont and the state of cannabis, and said in Vermont, marijuana is the new zucchini, because people grow it at home, they have a lot of it, and they're sharing it with their neighbors in a variety of different forms. So you kind of alluded to that, and whether or not that system is the best system moving forward. I think in many ways, from a criminal justice perspective, not getting people involved in the criminal justice system for possession makes a lot of sense, so that was a great first step. But I think at this point, the legislature is really seriously considering whether a regulated model, one that provides consumer protections, one that provides for testing, one that provides for robust oversight, is the step that we need to go as a state. So right now, I don't know how much you want to get into the
Give me the highlights of what you expect to be introduced, or is a bill in a committee coming in January.
Yeah, so last year the Senate, S-54 is the bill that's up for current consideration. The Senate passed it overwhelmingly. It has made its way through the initial committee, and it has touched many committees. I think at this point 7 or 8 different committees in the House, but the House Gov Ops Committee has done extensive work and passed out a substantive bill. It's 97 pages long, with many of the issues that we've touched on today are addressed, and we're happy to talk about what's in that bill vis-a-vis local control and things like that. The bill is currently in the House Ways and Means Committee, where they'll be looking at the tax rate, the fees. And just to be clear, this bill, while it's lengthy and very detailed, also is in some ways broad. It sets parameters that need to be followed, and it sets sort of the values that the legislature wants to move forward, but also leaves up to the Cannabis Control Board a significant amount of responsibility to get into the
Cannabis
details.
Control Board, a 5-member board. Who are the appointees?
Well, the Senate version of the bill has a 3-member. It's the governor, the House, and the Senate appoint the 3. In the House version of S-54, it's it's a 5-member board: the governor, the Senate, the House, the treasurer, and the Attorney General.
I like the House version.
So that's an issue that needs to be reconciled between the bodies, assuming the bill passes the House. But that board will then go through a lengthy and elaborate process of rulemaking, in which a lot of the details of the bill will be fleshed out.
What are we talking about for the revenue? You heard Kevin talk about the revenue in Massachusetts. Are there any expectations, number one? Number two, is there any discussion about where that revenue would be directed? Would it go to education, prevention, schools?
So the only the Senate version did not. All the money would go to the general fund in the Senate version of S-54, but the House specifically earmarked up to $6 million a year in revenue to prevention programs. As of now, that's the only thing that's been earmarked. There's a 2% local tax that's currently in the bill. Whether that remains or not, we'll see. And that money will go to localities that host cannabis businesses. So right now, there's a 16% general excise tax at the point of purchase, and then a 2% local option tax. We would say to your clients in Massachusetts, we have an 18% tax rate. One of the first times that Vermont has a lower tax rate than
That's why I'm
than our
conflicted.
surrounding states.
So I want to talk to you about the economics for a second, and I guess I'd open this up to anybody. How do you, part of, and I've evolved on this issue. I didn't support legalization. I certainly support medicinal and decriminalization. But I think like a lot of Vermonters, I had a very libertarian view about cannabis. It's not my business. It's up to what people are doing in the privacy of their home. But this is a business, and it needs transparency. It needs legitimacy. It needs regulations like any business. But part of the goal from a law enforcement perspective is to eradicate the black market, the illicit market. Is 20% or 18% the right tax to do that? Or do you get to a price point that it just grows the illicit market? What are the conversations? What's the analysis? And I guess I'd go to Dave and then Kevin and Erik.
Well, the legislature spent a lot of time. They'll continue to spend more time on this. I mean, we've looked at other states, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, where the tax rates are significantly higher, and there's still significant sales. But as we've seen in California, it's not just the tax rate. In California, they allowed localities to implement their own taxes. It's really the complexity of the taxation systems in all the states. But from all that we've heard, the testimony that's been taken, it seems like something around 18 to 20% is, at least from the analysis that the legislature has done so far, sort of the sweet spot. It could be less. The Senate bill started at 10%. Whether it could be more, who knows? But it seems from all the testimony that we've taken from other states that seems around the mark.
Kevin, what do you see in Massachusetts in terms of the illicit market based on that price point?
Yeah, I don't think it really matters if it's 18 or 20 for the illicit market. I think the things that are going to, right, I mean, let's be frank. I think most people want to buy product in a regulated environment where their product has been tested, and they do that in a legal way. And so I think there are a lot of drivers that people want to come to this regulated market, right? It's pretty easy to purchase. You can use cash, you can use debit cards. It's an anonymous process, and so you're not registering. And so there are a number of ways that people can buy this product, and it is easy. I think the issue is, for what is often driving the illicit market now, is whether you can get enough regulated product up and running quickly enough. And one of the challenges we have in Massachusetts is that our dispensaries have been a bit ahead of our cultivation that has come online. And so the product is rather expensive in Massachusetts, not because of the tax rate, although 2018 it is because we don't have enough regulated product that is getting produced by our cultivation site. So one of the things I would urge you to do in Vermont is sort of think about making sure that those cultivation sites, including some of the larger ones, come on at the same time that before those dispensaries come on, so you have enough regulated product. I think that's really one of the drivers that is the issue about illicit drugs.
Laura, let me go to you on that point. I mean, where is Vermont? And I guess I want to go to Laura and Charlotte on this in terms of that 500 square foot small cultivator to Massachusetts 10,000 square foot micro. What are the economics on this? How does it work? How do we get the product to the market?
It's interesting because in Massachusetts, a lot of people are reconditioning old mill buildings. That's the economic development opportunity, and they're looking for, and this is sort of what's happening in the
Is that the federal opportunity zone on the mill buildings?
Yeah.
Okay.
Holyoke, Springfield, a lot of these towns have these abandoned mill buildings, so it's an opportunity to revitalize communities, really. I say we're bringing jobs to towns that have depressed economies. So, and so the mill buildings have been an opportunity. People like them because you can harvest. I've really dug into the economics of this outdoor versus indoor grow and the how much production that you can actually
Does the
maximize.
climate support outdoor grow in the Northeast?
It's new. There was the first legal outdoor grows in Massachusetts were in the Berkshires, and they didn't get started until late. They didn't get in the ground until July, and they were small plants. They yielded, we can yield. We're trying, you talk about the per light yield and how many harvests you can get inside an indoor facility in a mill. You try to get 5 harvests a year, by fixing, adapting your lights. And so you have a high production indoor. But the outdoor plant isn't just going to grow the same way because you have to deal with, Mother Nature. And in California, it's a lot easier to grow these massive plants, and this is what's been happening in the market there. Suddenly prices went down recently when they harvested. Their price per pound was great when the market opened, and now it's pretty low because all these outdoor farmers have come online. We don't have that in Massachusetts. It's an indoor growing environment to some extent, greenhouses too, but the greenhouses, because of the climate, become almost as expensive as indoor. So it's, my facility is going to be, it's 28,000 square feet, and so, we just have to, we're going to produce, hopefully, several thousand pounds a year with eventually getting to 5 harvests. But it's expensive to fit out these indoor facilities.
What's the biggest cost?
HVAC, climate control, power. I'm trying to do, I'm very interested in, no outputs, just minimizing the outputs of our facility. So we're looking at things like we can generate power off of our heat. Solar doesn't really help much when you think about the amount of power that you need to run these things. But there's something called generating power off of your gas-fired heat systems. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of waste that comes out of these indoor production facilities because it's pretty serious.
Laura, let me ask you and I know you can't speak for them, but you're on the panel, but again, that perspective from the Vermont farmer, do we have capital costs to build, whether it's a greenhouse? Does that infrastructure exist? Back to Joe's point about perhaps some reluctance from banks to lend. Tell me what the view is.
Yeah, and can I just say, I didn't even really answer. It's about $200 a square foot to build indoor in Massachusetts right now. That's sort of the cost of the build and on using these old mill buildings. Yeah.
Well, and I'm not a Vermont farmer, but I have spoken to hundreds of them about this issue over the past several years. And I think that we need to be careful to recognize that each of the aspects of the cannabis policy might not achieve all of the goals that we're trying to achieve at once. So we can protect our small farmers and create access and remove barriers of access to our small farmers, and at the same time recognize, that might not be all we need to get the supply to where we really need it to be if we really want to eradicate larger percentages of the illicit market. And so I think those two things can happen at the same time, and that they're not at odds with each other. They can happen in ways that are compatible, so that we can, but I think that barriers to entries are enormous for small farmers, especially without lending, and there's no question about that.
Well, I want to ask Joe this question, and I think I understood it, but I want to be very clear that farmer comes to you to get a loan to build a greenhouse. It's going to be associated with they're going to cultivate cannabis there. Every banker is going to say no, correct?
There's a pretty good chance, yes, so that's what's going to happen.
Okay. Well, these are the challenges here. I want to go to license. And I kind of want to start with you, Erik. What's it cost to get a license? And what is that? And give us, I guess, the different types of license that you have.
Sure, the different types of licenses in Maine. We do our cultivation license, much like what it sounds like what's being proposed in Vermont in a tier system. We actually have 5 different tiers. There's a 500, 2,000, 7,000, and 20,000 square foot. And then we also have what I think is unique to Maine, a nursery license where you can buy and sell immature plants.
What's the cost? How much does a license cost?
Very, very small. I mean, it obviously goes up with the tiers. It starts somewhere from like $500 for the 5,000 square foot. Again, I think the intention there from the legislature was to set a priority on the small farmers and also participants that are currently in our medical program, all the way up to like, God, off the top of my head, I think it was like $30,000 for the 20,000 square foot cultivation facility. We also have manufacturing facility licenses, and then we also have our retail store licenses that carry what I would consider a significant cost, but when you look across at other states that have legalized markets, Maine's licensing fees are pretty low. And again, I think that was with the intention to help the early movers, Maine residents and participants in the medical program, to lower the barrier of entry there so they can get into the programs.
Kevin, give us the license cost structure in Massachusetts.
I honestly, I don't know, and I'll tell you why I don't know. It costs $1 million to open up a dispensary in Massachusetts.
Break that cost down for us.
It's depending on how much construction you're going to do, it's going to be $300,000, $400,000 to do construction. It's going to be, getting your security system up and running is another $100,000. And Charlotte's got reasonably priced, really smart lawyers, but they cost a little bit of money too. And so this just adds up. And so, but let me just talk about the licensing fee for a second. It's great. One of the things that my clients have always asked for is they would rather pay more money in licensing fees in order to ensure that the regulators have the tools that they need to do to regulate their business. And they are very happy to pay licensing fees. They'd be happy to pay double the licensing fees if the regulators said, we need that money to properly regulate this business. I don't think the licensing fees, to tell you the truth, the application fees are really a big issue in this area. I appreciate it's good to keep your application fees low, but I'd rather the question be, what do the regulators need to regulate this business, and then what do we need to do for licensing fees to ensure that the regulators have the resources that they need?
On that $1 million price tag, part of that is the requirement under Mass law to purchase and own real estate.
Or lease.
Or lease.
I had to carry and pay the rent. No one was going to let me just, secure an option something without paying them. And so I had to carry a lease for 11 months.
David,
before we could get
Dave or Laura, what are we talking about in terms of application fee, a license fee in Vermont? No requirement on real estate, or is there?
No, on the fees, that's yet to be determined. It's something that the Ways and Means Committee is going to think about and look at. But it very well, as the bill currently stands, I think the determinations on the fees are being left to the board to come up with a scheme for that. I mean, remember, if Vermont were to pass this bill this year, it would still be 18 months to 2 years before their sales likely, just because it could be quicker, but because of the rulemaking process. But
Erik, does that sound right to you? A 2-year rulemaking process?
We drafted about 85 pages of rules in like 2 months. Of course, we went at an insane pace, and it was a very odd exercise to go through. I would not recommend that. I would recommend taking your time and doing a very robust internal and external stakeholder engagement in that process. But yeah, as far as to get to a point, I think if you look at most states, it's something like 12 to 16 or 12 to 18 months from legalization to sale.
So I guess I want to...
It were 2 years. It took us 2 years, but that was because our legislature kind of slowed it down.
There is also, Vermont is unique in that we are one of the first states to do this through a legislative process. And so we have been deliberating about some of these details that will be part of the rulemaking now. In the current proposal, things have shifted. So in the earlier legislative proposals going back to 2014, 15, 16, there were a lot more details spelled out in the legislation, including the amounts of the fees and the tiered certification system and all of that kind of thing. This current proposal is, creates a cannabis control board and leaves a lot of those details out of the legislation. So that's a big change for Vermont. Whichever path we take, a lot of this discussion and debate and analysis and looking to our neighbors has already happened in Vermont. So it's a little bit of a different scenario than the states that get handed a referendum and then have to start the rulemaking after the law has already been passed. So it's an important distinction, I think.
Has there been conversation, Dave, then I'll go to Kevin and Erik on this, about a residency requirement in order to possess a license in Vermont?
That's yet to be determined, but yes, that's absolutely been conversations.
That you have to be a Vermont resident.
Well, some have said, should it be a priority? Should you get prioritization if you're a Vermont resident? Should it be a straight residency requirement? Other states have straight residency requirements for ownership. Some question is would ownership, would the requirement be 51% Vermont resident? And then, I mean, one of the issues is access to capital. So if we're requiring, for instance, only Vermont ownership and only Vermont capital, that's going to make it difficult for Vermont's industry to get off the ground.
Erik, Maine, is there a residency requirement in order to possess a license?
Yeah, there most certainly is. When it was actually passed via referendum, the way the bill was written was actually the first actors, the people that could get in the program first were our caregivers, our participants in our medical program. And when the legislature rewrote the bill, they didn't want it necessarily just to be the participant in the medical program, that there might be other Mainers, other farmers that wanted a shot at this new program. So they rewrote it with a residency requirement that the directors, the managers, the partners of the businesses that own these licensees all need to be Mainers. But the second point to that is there was a robust conversation in the legislature about equity ownership. There wasn't enough in Maine to really have a thriving program. So 51% equity owners need to be Maine residents. 49% equity owners can come from out of state. So I'm sure when you go through that process in the legislature in Vermont, there'll be a very robust conversation about that, but that's the way we're set up.
Kevin, Massachusetts residency requirement and thoughts on that?
We do not have a residency requirement in Massachusetts, and I think it's a bad idea, and I'll tell you why I think it's a bad idea. First is, look, there are, I forget now, what are we at, 11 regulated states, adult use states in the country right now. You are going to need to have out-of-state people help you set up these regulated businesses. This is a highly regulated industry, and you are going to need the people from out of state to help you do that in order to do it the right way. We had influx of people from Colorado when we opened ours, and those people helped us a lot. It made for a better system, and so I get nervous when you talk about residency requirements. The second reason I get nervous about it is, Erik is implementing the rules, not making up the rules. It becomes a very difficult, burdensome process for regulators to have to go through and analyze these businesses and understand who owns these businesses. And people like me, lawyers, spend a lot of time with regulators talking about our corporate structures instead of talking about how to make this system safe, how to do it in the right way. And so you can get bogged down a lot in these systems that talk about, and I'm sure Erik's doing it the right way, and no criticism at all, but you can get bogged down a lot in when you set up these sort of artificial rules about who owns and not. It really becomes a drag on a business. It means you got to hire lawyers, and it raises your costs.
Can I just add to that? Because I have to agree with Kevin. So in my past life, before the position I had now, I was a policy advisor for our Speaker of the House and Maine policy point person for the committee that actually rewrote the Maine Legalization Act. And at the time, when you're having these conversations, I mean, I might disagree that I think the residency piece is nice to kind of gear towards Mainers and give them the first shot. But when you're going through that process and setting it up, it may seem like a good idea. But now when I shift to this new position and I'm the regulator and I'm putting together a licensing regime, Kevin is spot on. Trying to understand the complex corporate structures and how their businesses and the flow of money keeps me up at night, among a few other things. But he's right on. It's just keep in mind that it may seem like a good idea, but it's very, very difficult to execute.
Charlotte, I want to talk about testing. Tell me what the requirement is in Massachusetts Who's doing, what's the cost, and who's certifying?
Well, I have to admit that we're not doing any testing yet.
Is there a requirement?
There is a requirement and there's a specific license for testing companies that third parties test your product. And then we're in the process of buying, so I'm asking all of the manufacturers and the cultivators to give me their test results so that I can look at how the product tests. That was a slow process. I think that getting the testing companies on board was one of the things that did slow down production in the state, because they were the last to get regulated. They didn't get certified until after the retailers were approved. There was some problem in the timing of things, I think. So I think it's getting better and there's not a backlog anymore, but it does add time. But it's nice to know that we can ask and look at test results of product. Whereas in the hemp industry, I started sort of exploring hemp, and it was really frustrating because I would ask people, what's the name of the variety that's in this CBD oil that you want to, this distillate that you want to sell? And no one could disclose what it was. So I like the testing regulations, really strong, robust testing in states, because we know that we can prove. I mean, we in the legal cannabis industry, we actually are under so much more scrutiny relative to any other form of agriculture. Any plant that you eat and put in your body, you can't get the kind of test results that are publicly available like you can with cannabis.
Joe, same question, different facts. Testing company wants a loan. Reluctant to lend?
I haven't heard anyone ask that of a financial institution before, so I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I would guess that if it is able to be interpreted as, aiding a business that is dealing in a product that's still federally legal, that it still poses an issue for a financial institution that's federally insured.
Thank you. Kevin, give me the rundown of the testing requirements in Massachusetts. Is there a certifying authority? Where do the test results go?
So we went with the system of a third-party testing, and so we have, I think now, 3 third-party testing companies that have been licensed by the state. So these are independent companies. They are required to not have any ownership in a dispensary or cultivation site, so they truly have to be independent. That system has worked somewhat well. I think that the problem that we ran into in Massachusetts, which was we didn't, the testing lab licenses didn't catch up with the number of dispensaries. And so we had many more dispensaries than we had testing labs, and we got a backlog. And so one of the lessons that I think you bring to Vermont is you got to make sure that you license enough testing labs so you can test this product in a quick and efficient way, in a safe way, make sure that's done well, but it doesn't become a backlog on the system.
On the licensing of the testing, is it specific to cannabis, or is it CBD, hemp, and cannabis, or is there a breakdown?
So I don't know the answer to that question. They do other types of testing. There's a specific, very detailed regulatory structure for cannabis, and our cannabis regulators in Massachusetts do not regulate hemp in any way. That's a different entity, and they set up a certain area in the labs that are specifically for cannabis, because you're going to have regulators in there who are going to go through that process. And just picking up what Joe said, they have a hard time getting loans as well, and it's really because they're a plant touching entity. They're actually touching the plants, and that's the reason they have a hard time with loans. So,
Dave, Laura,
Yep.
Where are we on testing in Vermont? And talk a little bit about the hemp industry in Vermont. It was booming. Perhaps, according to reports, that we had an oversupply this past harvesting season. Are we testing there or not? What does it look like?
Well, I'll just start on the testing. The testing in the bill in S54, again, it models other states. There'll be third-party testing required for products. They've prioritized the licensing of the testing labs to make sure that they're up and running so that small cultivators and others can get their products tested prior to going to market. But the testing issue is an interesting one, as and I'm not an expert on hemp, but Right now, under new proposed federal guidelines, testing laboratories will need to be DEA certified. So there's a question, and it's not required for cannabis, but there's a question whether there will be testing labs in Vermont that will be DEA certified for hemp products, and whether those same laboratories likely could be the same ones that are doing the testing for cannabis. It's unclear at this point.
But I guess I'll go back to my opening remarks. Isn't the genie out of the bottle on this? I mean, the product is in the store. It's on the counter in gas stations, and now we're going to put a new rule saying it's got to be tested. What happens to those products that are already in the stream of commerce?
You're talking about hemp or
Yeah.
CBD products? Well, I mean,
Because I think it's analogous if we're talking about a retail regulated market and that distribution chain about how you get it to market.
yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
Well, I think there are conflicts between the new rules that have come down federally on hemp and what Vermont has moved forward with, and that's creating a lot of anxiety. I think that Vermont has done a lot of really positive things around the rules they've set up around hemp, and should, I hope, carry on. We have states that are adopting policies and developing programs that are against federal law. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers on this panel, and that's just a fact. And my hope is that states will continue to lead the way, and that eventually some of the problems with the new rules that have come down from federally on hemp will change too. But there is a conflict there. There's no question about that.
But without robust testing, the illicit market has an area to now enter.
Well, there will be robust testing in Vermont. It just won't be in line with the testing as it relates to hemp. So there's no doubt that that regulators in Vermont have the legislature and others have prioritized that third-party testing. I mean, the entire sort of import of the bill in many ways is a consumer protection bill, and testing is a key part of that. So interesting, in the Department of Health just put out some information about cannabis in Vermont, the Vermont Department of Health.
Yeah.
And one of the things they said, interestingly, was that you should check the THC content on cannabis in Vermont. Well, we can't do that because we don't have a regulated market at this point. But that's the type of thing, I think, the testing is a key part of knowing whether there's pesticides, knowing whether there's what THC content, and there's a limit on THC content.
And that's a consumer protection issue. Charlotte, to your point, or perhaps Kevin, about the consumer walking in saying, I want to know what I'm buying, and I want to know what I'm going to put into my body.
Can I make a comment on that as well? Because my cultivator's from California, and we've been really following what they've been doing on testing, and it's been interesting to see they've rolled out the testing protocols over time, over a year, and people started failing as they became more and more rigorous. And one of the things that came up last year that was really interesting to me, or earlier this year, was that they started in this past summer testing hardware. And I think that that's really important.
What does that mean?
The vaping hardware. There's so much stuff that is made in China that has lead in it, and I'm actually personally very concerned about that.
Okay.
And in Massachusetts, the hardware isn't tested, and so you're heating these products that have lead in them. The coils have lead, and there are very few manufacturers for some of this vaping hardware that passed these California tests over the summer. So everyone failed the lead test. So I think if I could just advocate for one thing, because I am very concerned about producing a safe product, is to look to what California implemented in their taste.
On the Massachusetts vaping ban, did it include hardware?
It did, but Charlotte hit on the point, which is all vaping was banned in Massachusetts. It's going to be relieved as of December 11th. But Charlotte hit the point right on, right, which is the reason that you need a regulated cannabis product is because so many people are turning to the illicit market for their vaping products. And the way we're gonna address this vaping issue is through testing of these products. And once we get the right system for testing them in Massachusetts, we will have a testing system that deals with some of these evils in these products, the lead, the vitamin E acetate. And that's why this testing and the regulated product is so important. And we will get there in Massachusetts, but Charlotte hit it right on the head.
Let me ask this question. I want to go back to the regulatory framework. And I was watching 60 Minutes. It's after the Patriots won. And I don't know if anybody saw this, but it was on California. And they talked about the oversupply of cannabis in California. And one of the reasons, if I understood the segment correctly, was because of the issue of local control that gave municipalities the ability to veto whether or not a retail shop could open up. Created oversupply. Well, the supply's got to go somewhere. It went into the illicit market. And if I heard correctly, Laura, and I'll go to Kevin and to Erik on this, that we have a statewide regulatory framework, whether it's a 5-person, 3-person, 5-person commission in Massachusetts. But then we got this local structure, and you're allowing towns to opt in and opt out. And is that going to create a system of haves and have-nots, and perhaps problems and not problems, or revenue and not revenue? Let me start with Laura and then go down the line here.
I think it's a huge issue and a critically important one. Right now, what we have is a difference between the Senate version and the House version of the proposal in Vermont. So the Senate version did not have an opt-in. The House version had opt-in only for retail, and everything else the businesses could just would be allowed because it would be silent. And I think that's a really important distinction. It's a really important issue. We have right now the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is very actively advocating for opt-in for everything, and I think that would be a huge mistake. I think our farmers need to know I'm going to be able to add a cannabis crop to my small farm, and it is a huge barrier to access if you don't have predictability about whether in your location you're going to be able to operate this business. But so that remains to be seen. We also have a governor who was concerned about this issue, and that's some of the reasons why we got to where we did in the House.
Kevin, framework in Massachusetts at the local level.
We have an opt-out system in Massachusetts, and about a third of the towns, last time I checked, had opted out. It's a voter referendum, however, and so the voters have to affirmatively vote to opt out. It has initially thought was going to be a big barrier, but to tell you the truth, I think the 2/3 of towns that didn't opt out are the ones that are the winners on this, and I think some of the towns so far who opted out are sort of rethinking that. You are absolutely right. It really harms the cultivators, because the cultivators are just cultivating, right? You can't sell a product at that site, and so you're not having an effect on the town's residents, but necessarily by cultivating. And so that's been a real harm, though, and so I would, at the very least, I would tell you do an opt-out. Don't do an opt-in, because it sometimes can be hard. But I'm not even sure you want to even give towns the ability, especially on the cultivation side, to prevent the problem.
Dollars to the town's general fund?
Yep. So the standard is 3% of revenues from cultivation. Any marijuana business in a town, 3% of the revenues are going directly to the town.
Erik, local control in Maine?
Yep, like we talked about earlier, full opt-in for everything. We give a lot of power to the towns to pick and choose what they want. Some of our more progressive, larger southern towns have just opted in for everything, and then you see some other towns that will opt in for just cultivation or just manufacturing. It's oddly enough one of the ones that the towns tend to stay away from are the retail, which is a concern for, again, what you're speaking to in California.
Well, let me play devil's advocate on this a little bit. Are we going to create two different systems where affluent towns don't want it in their town? The less affluent towns are going to have it because they may need the money. Or is that a legitimate concern or not?
So I'm sorry. In Massachusetts, it's not really been the affluent towns who have banned it. You know, the Bostons, the suburban suburbs of Boston, for the most part, have allowed it. Obviously, the Western Mass Berkshires have allowed it, and there's some very affluent towns that have allowed it. You know, it really gotten into a more of a conservative, liberal, progressive, conservative issue as to which towns have prevented it, and it's not necessarily tracked to income or.
Okay.
And also too, right? It's the licenses so far, except for a little bit in Greater Boston, have been spread around the state. So I think we're probably at the point now that probably the farthest resident in Massachusetts probably at most has to drive maybe a half hour to their nearest dispensary. So it's not a big deal.
Kevin, I want to ask you this question. You said drive, which sparked a question about has there been an increase in driving under the influence cases, to the best of your knowledge, with cannabis in Massachusetts since full legalization?
So this is a challenge, right? We don't have a procedure, right? We don't have a product. We don't have a way to test, and so that has been an issue, and it's one that the industry is heavily focused on, working with police chiefs. The one thing I do want to say on this issue, though, right, is that this, there was a feeling in Massachusetts when these things were opening that every parking lot of these dispensaries was going to be like Woodstock, right? And for those of you who haven't been to an adult use dispensary in Massachusetts, these are the most controlled environments you've ever been in. Most of them have a police officer, a detailed police officer out front. There is no.
And let's just be clear: detailed police officer, the business is paying for the police officer, not the town.
There is no tolerance for any use of the product on premises, and no tolerance for any use of the product anywhere in the neighborhood of those places. And so I a little bit off, but it's a really, for anybody who hasn't been to one, it's a very, very controlled environment.
Dave, you were going to say something.
Well, I can speak to what the bill does around this issue, around highway safety, but just on the previous point, just to be clear, the localities retain all of their inherent rights around zoning and permitting and things like that. So even whether it's an opt-in or opt-out system, there will be local control to the extent that they can, you can't override local ordinance and zoning procedures and things like that. What the legislature did do, learning from the Massachusetts example, at least so far, was reject this idea of host agreements, which really.
What's a host agreement?
I mean, a host agreement is a specific contract between, and folks in Massachusetts can correct me, specific contract between the business and the locality over a variety of things. Oftentimes, what we heard in testimony was things like, well, you have to make a contribution to the Boys and Girls Club, or you have to do X, Y, and Z, and it seemed like that was a massive barrier to entry for many of the businesses in Massachusetts. So the Vermont legislature at this point has said those host agreements aren't appropriate, but they have said that localities will retain their ability to regulate as they would any other business. So,
Joe, if you can't bank, where's the money going on this? Where's the revenue and the profits going? If you know.
So, we have one credit union in Vermont that serves is it 5 medicinal dispensaries we have in Vermont? So we have one credit union that is serving all of those dispensaries. And they are taking in the cash from those businesses because those businesses are limited to dealing in cash. One of the issues that businesses like Charlotte's will have to contend with, or do have to contend with, is, it's not just finding a financial institution to make your deposit at, who probably is not going to lend to you. So you are resorting to going to high-price lenders like Charlotte referenced, but you also are not able to get credit and debit card processing. So you're a cash business, and having all that cash on the street is a problem. As your office knows, it has the potential to raise crime and whatnot. And so that's why, there are, and it's predominantly credit unions nationwide, that have become depositories for dispensaries of all types.
So, and I don't know the distinction between Vermont law and Massachusetts law on this point, but in Massachusetts, you can use a debit card. And so you cannot use a credit card to make a purchase, but you can use a debit card to make a purchase. So I think most of our clients say that about 50% of the transactions now are in debit cards and 50% of the transactions are in are cash. Now, I will say that the security around the cash is another cost driver for these businesses. I will say, though, that this, again, is one of the most tightly controlled things that these institutions do. And they are generally taking that cash out on a they generally are hiring security firms to help them with that cash, who set up security procedures to get that cash out. That was one of the lessons that was learned from Colorado.
That's right.
Where there were a
That's
couple of robberies. And that has not been an issue in Massachusetts. This cash gets out in a very safe way and in a way that is in a secure environment. So it's not been an issue.
Reminds me, in 2013, I, along with I think about 10 other Vermonters, Dave Mickenberg being one of them, and the Commissioner of Public Safety and others, went out to Denver to study their market. And we were at a grow facility. And pretty amazing. And I said to the guy, I said, "How do you bank?" He looked at me and said, "Brinks." I said, "What?" I said, "Brinks." I said, "Brinks truck comes to the front door." So I don't think any of us would agree that that's a good system. Joe.
Two things real quick. One, you remind me that in Colorado, it's credit unions that are the largest number of depositories in Colorado for credit unions. And they tell me that there are entrepreneurs who have set up armored car services specifically for this business. They're not using Brinks or some well-known organization like that. They're private entrepreneurs who went out and bought an armored truck, and they do nothing but go to dispensaries and bring money to the credit unions. And the second point is, when I reference that dispensaries have difficulties being able to accept plastic cards, it's not in Vermont anyway because of the Vermont law. It's because Visa and MasterCard
Right.
are opposed. They have the same issue that financial institutions do because of the federal illegality of it.
Laura, I want to ask this question. In Vermont, we talk about social equity on this issue. Tell us what that means, and then how is it being implemented?
So when we have these conversations, I think it's always absolutely essential to bring to the forefront of the conversation the devastating history of cannabis prohibition and all the people that have been harmed in its wake. And it's primarily people of color have been hurt way more by prohibition than white people. And this is true in Vermont, it's true across the country, and it's just an egregious part of our history that when we talk about what these systems should look like, part of what they need to look like is righting that wrong. So when we talk about social equity, we're talking about bringing people who have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition into emerging cannabis businesses. One of the very first ways you do that is by expunging criminal records for cannabis possession, by reducing penalties for other low-level possession crimes, and not making prior cannabis possession convictions a barrier to access to these emergent industries. That's part of it. And there are also huge economic justice issues involved that were part of cannabis prohibition. So we had decrim in Vermont, it was in 2013, and yet we were still issuing thousands of violations for cannabis for having possession of small amounts of cannabis, which carried about a $250 fine, which is a slap on the wrist to someone who has money. It's a week of wages for someone who's making minimum wage. So we have to recognize how our policies have hurt people who have less, and bring those people into these emerging businesses by having prioritization for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, businesses in communities that have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition.
Charlotte, what keeps you up at night?
It's funny. I mean, Kevin knows, one of the things that was actually really hard for me was that I actually do care a lot about that. You mentioned the farms that I did in San Francisco. Before I went to the dark side, if you will, in capital markets, I worked in social justice issues for a really long time, and criminal justice reform was, I've never really understood why, it's a plant that grows, for a reason on our planet, and why did we put people in jail over it? It bothers me, and why have certain communities been really, really hurt by the criminalization of this plant? So I have been working really hard to bring people into my organization from these communities and provide opportunity to people. So, for example, one of the things that we're doing, there's an organization in the state of Massachusetts that works a lot with law enforcement to provide alternative sentences and, working with DAs to make sure people don't get put in jail over nonviolent crimes. And so I'm working with this organization, and all these young people of 21 and over who are in this program are doing internships with me to get careers in the cannabis industry. So, making sure I can find a way to provide a platform for people in communities that have been hurt by this to come on board with me and help build our business together, and just making sure I can make that work. I talk a lot about it, and it keeps me up at night, just actually getting traction on this and proving, a lot of people don't believe me when I say that. They say, oh, you worked at Goldman Sachs. I automatically don't believe that you actually want to do something good. And so I'm always overcoming that. And so, and I'm just proving to the world, even Kevin didn't believe, he thought it was going to be hard. What I proposed to the commission, he thought they weren't, that I have a unique structure that I proposed, and no one really believed that we could do this. And so now it's time for me to bring all these young men into my organization and see if this little social experiment that I'm interested in trying is going to work.
Right.
So that's an interesting question on the heels of what you were just saying.
Kevin, do we know how many jobs have been created in Massachusetts as a result of?
Sure, somebody knows. I don't know. I will say that your average dispensary in Massachusetts has 35. Yeah. 35 people working there, and it depends on the size of your cultivation site. One of our clients is one of the larger cultivation sites has 200 people working there. But obviously they're much smaller sites. But you can just do the math from there and realize how the effect is people. I will say it is Charlotte can talk about it. It is a great driver for people in their 20s who are looking for responsibility and looking to move up in a very kind of freewheeling and fast-moving environment. And so you walk into these places and you see a lot of eager faces and people who want to work hard.
Increase in tourism dollars as a result of
I think
legalization?
It's too early. I joke about the number of Vermonters who've come to Massachusetts, but I haven't seen any stats on that. I'll tell you though, you can go to any of the ones that are near the borders, any state borders, and half the license plates at least are from out of state. So yeah, it's a big driver.
Erik, what keeps you up at night on this?
I feel like it would be easier to go through what doesn't keep me up at night in the middle of implementation right now. We talked about the corporate structures and the residency piece. It's very complicated. Rolling out a successful mandatory testing regime, it's such a vital part to the program and so important that it's done right to avoid some of the pitfalls that other states have seen. We haven't even talked about track and trace yet. Giant IT projects that can really cause a lot of trouble on the industry side and state side is a huge, and specific to Maine, those are the three big things that are really tough to work and manage, at least with the implementation piece. In Maine, much like Vermont, if you were to pass legalization, is aligning your two programs. Not enough people actually talk about that. So Maine has had a medical program for about 10 years now. And for whatever reason, over the last 10 years, it hasn't been given the resources or the attention it's needed, and it's turned into this very libertarian model way of doing things. And then in 2016, the voters of Maine come along and asked for adult use tax and regulate, right? So the two different programs are like oil and water, yet in Maine you have the Office of Marijuana Policy, which is the oversight agency for both programs. That presents a bunch of different challenges on a number of different levels, most specifically like the operations of the office itself. So one of the biggest things that keeps me up at night is trying to figure out a way, and I steal this term from the executive director of Massachusetts, the lift and shift, how to lift and shift the medical program to align with the adult use program while serving its purpose. There is a significant difference between patients and consumers, so doing it right both for the patients, the program participants, and the state it is a very difficult task.
Okay. So we get about a half hour left, and I want to open it up to the audience for some questions, but I want to reserve some time at the end for the panelists to give final thoughts and recommendations. And I have another question too I want to ask, but I'm cognizant of the time. So if you do have a question, since I think this is on public access, just please go to the microphone so we can pick up. Great. Go ahead. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good.
My name is Catherine Antley. I'm a physician and I'm a member of the Vermont Medical Society. And I think that our concern is that commercialization is going to increase use. We know that 80% of product is consumed by just 20% of users, and therefore anyone who's interested in making money on this endeavor is going to be interested in creating addiction. And we're seeing in Colorado and all the other commercialized states that indeed they are focusing on addiction, and they're doing that by creating a more concentrated product, a more addictive product, and in making, advertising to children, THC gummies and that kind of thing. And in fact, in Washington State, where they tried to regulate that, to rule it out, the lobbyists, I don't know how they did it, but they reversed the rule. They passed the rule and then reversed the rule. I find that, and I think many in the American Academy of Pediatrics and others find that very concerning. And so I think that it's important. I guess my question is around, will you do another panel where we have, physicians and social workers so we can, explore this other position that many Vermonters hold? Thank you.
I'm always up for public panels. And I had this conversation with Judge Joseph. I mean, for me, we're past go on this. I mean, we have legalized possession, and we have now created a legal limbo in Vermont where I think kids are more at risk because you don't have regulation, where you don't have transparency, and when you don't have legitimacy to these markets. So the Okay, that's what I said, Judge. Thank you. So let me. Okay. So I'm always happy to do that, but let me have Erik respond.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think a good approach for Vermont and what's made us very successful, again, I don't know if we talked about stakeholder engagement, but the close relationship we have with public health officials in helping draft our regulations, how to operate our program is such an important piece to that. I mean, right in our mission statement as the office is to protect the health and safety of all Mainers and really help building a culture, at least from the regulator side, to ingrain that into your staff, to ingrain that into the culture that's going to regulate the industry, that's what should be guiding the decision-making in your program will help to that end. And also, I mean, I would just go to the policy position. I mean, there are policy positions you can take to help protect against a lot of the things that you're saying. And then also, I always refer back to, if it's in a regulated market with mandatory testing, you would think that it would be a little bit safer than the untested product that's currently out there.
Sir.
Thank you, sir. Bishop Jethro James, Newark, New Jersey. I'm a retired urban development executive at PSE&G, advisor to the last 6 governors and 10 attorney generals in the state on all urban matters, police matters also. Survivor, ground zero, did the triage there, state police, chaplain. I've led the fight and worked our current governor and Governor Corzine, former Governor Corzine, you probably know from Goldman Sachs. Well, I've been advisor to both of them. And I've led the fight against what you're doing here. Number one, we have a problem in New Jersey. We lead the nation in low birth rate babies. Nobody's talking about the THC that stays in the mother's breast milk. No one is talking about the psychosis that goes on with the children. When we just recently defeated the bill, one of the things happened. Bergen County is one of the richest counties in our state. If you watch the Housewives of New Jersey, they all live in Bergen County. Well, the edible somehow got loose in the Bergen County schools, Attorney General, and all the kids wound up in the hospital. Many of them didn't look like us, and so they froze the bill. They couldn't get it through, and of course, the bill is now dead. We ask that if you're going to do this, and we know the problems that it brings in young folks' minds, would you set aside 20, 30% for the trouble that it's going to come for these children that are born addicted? You guys aren't even talking about that. You talk about you want to do it the Vermont way. Well, let's talk. Vermont, I believe, they had the Minutemen. They led the fight against tyranny from the British. What you guys are doing, you're going to terrorize your own community. The reality is, why do you need, you already have legalized, the people have the right, why do you need this business? No state has been able to regulate it. No state, and you're brand new at it, you two are brand new at it, has been able to keep out the black market. No state. What makes you think that you're going to be different?
Thank you for the question. Dave.
Just to that point, the bill in the House does dedicate 30% of the tax revenue to the substance abuse prevention fund. So.
Okay. Yeah.
I would, just on the last two comments, just to make something clear, you're not allowed to sell a product in Massachusetts, a cannabis product that is appealing to children. There are specific consumer protection. I'm going to finish my point.
Let's be civil. Let's be civil.
There's a specifically laid out in the law, and there's specific, very, very detailed regulations that are around that. And I would urge Vermont, and I presume Vermont is thinking about this, on having some sort of structure that is like that. None of my clients want to be selling product to children. That is not something any of them want to do. And if they do that, they are going to lose their license and they are going to be out of business.
And I can just add, every single legislative proposal that's been considered in Vermont since they started considering legalization measures have had prohibitions against marketing products that are appealing to children and have protections for children and have contemplating funding for substance misuse treatment.
Can I just speak as a mother too, myself? I am a cannabis consumer. I mean, I have been for a long time. I sometimes choose to have a tincture, before bed, or have a joint before when I'm with friends, and instead of having a glass of wine. And I'm not an addict. My children are not allowed to consume cannabis, just like they can't have a glass of wine or a beer, and so I parent them around this the way that I do with anything that they're not allowed to do. They know that their mom sometimes smokes pot, and I've done pretty well in my life, and my kids are healthy, and all my friends smoke pot too. And I'm really, it's a plant. And I actually use it as an alternative. Sometimes I get anxiety, and I would much rather take a cannabis tincture with CBN in it, which actually has some very therapeutic properties to it, than this pharmaceutical drugs that are sold legally by doctors. So, that's just my personal point of view on that. And I'm into the whole plant that grows out here. It's here for a reason. It has certain properties that I think can be beneficial to people, and for lots of different reasons. And I really, I'm in this business to help change the culture and the point of view around that, and that's really important to me.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Melamede. I was a former research professor at UVM here, and I was former chairman of the biology department at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs For 10 years, I taught the world's only course on endocannabinoids and medical marijuana. I'm 72 years old. I've been using cannabis daily for 56 years. It's the only thing that allowed me to learn how to learn. I would not have a degree without cannabis. And the pathetic truth is that cannabis is not a drug. It's a necessary nutrient for optimizing human health. It's an anti-aging drug. It inhibits the free radicals that are responsible for aging. We cure cancer sometimes in 3 weeks with the use of cannabis. This is all ridiculous. Cannabis is nothing more than an essential nutrient for optimizing human health. When you don't have it, you age quicker. This is just nonsense, lack of knowledge of what is going on in the scientific community, the scientific world. I have a webpage, Canna Sapiens. If you go there, you can see tons of literature. I gave a lecture recently at Harvard showing the effect of cannabis killing cancer. What we are doing is killing our people.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Hello, I'm Casey Massey. I own a couple retail stores here in Vermont. Get yours. I want to talk first about addiction because I do think it's an important thing. I too am a mother and a community member, and our stores are actually geared to not let anyone in that's under those ages, so the exposure to our products would be severely limited. I also think it's important that we're teaching our kids about these things. I have a 13-year-old boy myself, and I have talked to him about drug use and how his mind is still developing until the age of 21. So he should not smoke any cannabis-related products before that because we want him to have a nice, healthy, strong mind. But I also think there's other things that are going on that are important for us to know during this. So I'm going to ask a couple specific questions for you two gentlemen. Do you guys have a limitation on retail stores owning one shop?
Yes.
You do. So one store, one shop.
Oh,
one
I'm
license.
sorry. No, for retail shops, we have common ownership of 3.
Okay. Do you think that that's a benefit, having stores own multiple stores? Maybe they pay their taxes better or more organized than people that might just have one shop?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. As the regulator, yeah, I don't.
All right. And then you, sir, on the end. Can you tell me how that 18% is actually going to come to be? Are the farmers going to pay it on a wholesale price? Are we going to do a sales tax? Do we have any clue how that's going to work?
It's not technically a sales tax because that has a legal definition that's separate and apart. That money would be 6% that goes to the ed fund,
Okay.
but it's an 18% excise tax. I'm sorry, it's a 16% excise tax at the point of sale. So if you were buying something for $100, it'd be adding 16% on that. And then if there was a locality participating, there'd be another 2% on that.
Okay, so the retailers are going to cover
at
that.
the retail store, yeah, at the point of sale. Yeah.
So I know we want to be able to allow a lot of people into this market, but I think when we're doing this, it's very important not to put barriers in place in order to limit the people that do know how to run a business and pay that very important tax. So just please keep that in mind when you are helping. As far as you, Mr. In the middle, the banker.
Not a banker, Mr. Credit Union guy.
Credit union guy. So my big problem here is, say I have a retail store and I'm renting it, right? And the guy has a mortgage on it. Is there any way he could get in trouble with his mortgage company by renting to me?
The landlord?
The landlord.
You're renting from, and he has a mortgage with some financial institution.
Yeah.
It's possible, you know, I won't say get in trouble, but it's a matter of whether he'll get his mortgage.
Okay.
Because they're going to look at, if they're doing their due diligence, they're going to have to look at, you're a landlord, what kind of tenants are you renting to?
Perfect.
But, you know, they may or may not ask that. It varies by institution.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Good evening. Thank you for taking our questions and for considering all thoughts. My name's Judith Margulies. I have a healthcare background, and I do live in Massachusetts. And I wanted to ask a question specifically about Curaleaf of Massachusetts, and it's a kind of a math question, but Curaleaf of Wakefield, Mass. is currently described as the largest Vermont medical marijuana license holder in Vermont. That's on their website. A Russian money-funded national cannabis company is Curaleaf. They're self-described as now the world's largest cannabis company in the world. That was as of June of 2019. These are all things that have been reported in the press, not necessarily local press, not the Boston Globe, I can tell you, but in places like the New York Times and the Oregonian and places like that. So they are currently, as of June, they were controlling the markets in 19 states in the United States. They believe that they're now controlling in 23. So my question is, how will the Vermont residents compete with this company? Because they have described their indoor grow facilities as 250,000 square feet, doing the math times 200, 50 million? 250, if it's 200 per square feet, right? 250,000 square foot indoor facilities by Curaleaf of Wakefield, Massachusetts.
Sure,
I'd like
sure.
to know.
I'd be happy
I'd
to
like
address
to
that.
know how the Vermont resident is going to work with this company that has expressed intention by their two primary, they're Russian billionaires. They're billionaires, Russian money.
All right,
So I had that question.
Sure.
How
So
will
When you talk
Vermont
about a
compete
250,000 square foot facility, what Curaleaf is saying is that they don't have one 250,000 square foot facility. They've added up all their, no, they do not.
No.
They've added up all their facilities across the country. And so the way they're not, and you can't ship, and Curaleaf can't ship their product across state lines, right? And so they have to grow the product here in Vermont in their own cultivation facility. I don't know the size of that facility, but I presume it's been approved by the regulators here. It's not anywhere near the size of 250,000 square feet. That's a huge facility. There's no facility that size in the country right now. So you're taking their national average and you're using it locally. So and then the second thing I'll say is, this is why you have strong regulations in your state, and this is why you think about having license, as the woman before you talk about having a specific license restriction on the number of licenses you can own. And that's what Massachusetts did. So in Massachusetts, as you know, Curaleaf only owns 3 retail licenses, and that's a way that a lot of states have decided, including Maine, have to limit the influence of larger businesses. And in a lot of states, it really has worked. And I think Curaleaf is pretty happy here, but I don't know that. So
I think, actually, just to add, you did describe this when you were commenting about licenses and the way the business is actually organized. So what they're describing, including on some local somebody in Vermont has a podcast on this currently, that all they do is take over management through contracts. They don't actually own the license. And they may not own at this point 51%, but I'm not going to argue with you. I just want you to wanted to ask that question, because $50 million for, as they said, 250,000 square feet. They said that. There's a video online.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Hi, I'm Martha Hafner. I'm from Randolph, Vermont. I'm here, I have 2 points, really. I'm a teacher by background, and I always put on my applications, the brains of our youth are the most precious natural resource that we have. And now I'd add, to protect. Massachusetts was encouraging Vermont with the Senate. I was in on the hearing with Dick Ceres, where they were being saying, keep it at the 500 feet away from your schools. We did increase it to 1,000 feet, but I ask, why not a mile like it is for the sex offenders? Why not keep it so that it's really away from our schools and being a much more attractive across the street, slip out during your break kind of scenario, and try to put a barrier in place to try and protect our youth?
Okay.
That's one question point. Let me comment on the second. At a recent GOP gathering in Washington, Mitzi Johnson was invited to speak. She's the House Speaker. She's a Democrat, and GOP were inviting her. And it was a question of, they were asking, what question would you like us to discuss? And I said, SAMHSA put out a figure that was in 2014, and it was quoted in the Vermont Department of Health website, that said here's this lovely map, and Vermont ends up being bright red because we have more illegal drug use than the average number of states. And they said $600 billion is being spent by U.S. taxpayers.
Excuse me, ma'am,
to address-
we're short on time. Do you have the question? What's the second question?
So I'm getting to it. $600 billion is U.S. taxpayers is going to drug-related expenses. My question, and it's not necessarily for this panel to answer, but it's one that the state needs to address, is what kind of expenditure are we putting into drug-related expenses already here in Vermont, and do we really want to be fanning that with additional gateway access?
Thank you. Dave, do we know, is there a restriction in terms of where a retail operation can be placed in relation to a school?
That's something that the legislature is still considering. I do want to say that what they have done, certainly in the House version of the bill and even in the Senate version bill, there's very, very strict requirements related to advertising, related to what needs to be on the packaging, related to breastfeeding mothers, relating to driving. I mean, they have essentially, within the parameters of the law, made advertising virtually impossible.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Sir.
Hello, my name's Robert. I'm 31, so I was a young person before dispensaries were really a thing, and there wasn't a legal way for adults to purchase cannabis. And just want to offer another perspective to some of the people here. It was way easier to get cannabis than alcohol when I was younger. Cannabis was not regulated, was not purchasable in stores, and I could get it when I was 13, 14, 15. I couldn't find a way to get alcohol until I was 18, 19, 20. You know what I mean? So when it comes to protecting the youth, putting it in the hands of who knows who doesn't seem to work. I mean, prohibition has failed over and over anyways. We've already seen that. There's no real example we can give to show that by keeping it out of regulated areas is not going to keep it out of the hands of kids. So I think it's important for the people who are here trying to protect children to consider that we need oversight. The only way to provide oversight is going to be through regulation. Look at the lung vaping thing. That had to do with vitamin E acetate. So that came from unregulated products that had no oversight. Fentanyl, same thing. You just look at all these different things. Never works.
Thank you, sir. Sir.
I just want to thank everyone for this event, the Attorney General, the esteemed panel. I think this is a fantastic event. My name is Jeffrey Pizzatello. If you guys don't know, I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Growers Association. We are Vermont's new, basically the Vermont Brewers Association, but for our emerging cannabis scene. So we represent small businesses, family farmers of such. And just for a moment, listening to the sentiments here, we've already heard some concerns about retail access, barriers to entry. We even heard some far-fetched claims about Russians owning some of the dispensaries in our state, okay? So there's concerns out there in the state. And so one of the things that I want to bring to awareness, at least, is we recently closed our policy survey. It's an annual survey that we send out. And one of the things that, just to be nuanced for a moment, is that's important to family farmers is canopy size. And right now, Vermont in S54 has about 500 square feet as its initial offering. And what we've heard through our survey, which is aligned with other states, is more or less a 2,000 plus square foot canopy size, at least for initial entry. That speaks to sustainability for these families and these small businesses that are running these entities. It's just accepting that reality. 500 square feet is not realistic by any measure. We have friends in New Jersey who are passing REC soon.
Do you have a question?
I do. So, with all of this in mind and the general consensus of what we're hearing, and we respect the sentiment that the discussion is closed, if you will, moving forward for our next legislative session. How can you guys ensure that maybe you can bring some of us into the fold? These family businesses that are out here clearly with ideas that aren't possibly represented in S54. There's probably better ways to do that. How can Vermont ensure that we're
Thank
listening
you.
to those voices as well?
Laura, you want to take that? How can we be more inclusive?
Sure. I think one of the exciting opportunities of the current proposal is that it is broad, and it does create this commission where a lot of things will happen, and a lot of the details will be decided further on down the road, which means that, first of all, there's going to be a formal rulemaking process where public commentary is going to be required, and then there's a lot of time for advocacy with the Cannabis Control Commission. So there's still time for voices to be heard. There needs to be a lot of advocacy about who's going to ultimately be on that commission and how these decisions are going to be made. So if we can move forward with S54, it gives us the vehicle to keep these conversations going instead of keeping the small businesses in limbo indefinitely. So I think your points are, I think it's very critically important, and I think those are the ways that it can still happen in Vermont.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm cognizant of time. We got 3 questions left. Eli, you're gonna have the last question. If you have a question, let's ask the question.
Definitely. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I actually might have a slight response towards that. Remember that we got this all started because of the patients. We have to keep in mind, we are providing medicine for people. So for that reason, maybe one of the best things to do is actually stack caregivers on top of each other. When you take a look at Vermont law, there's not too much stuff actually allowing patients to basically have one select grower and have a pool of people under one grower. If a patient likes the way somebody grows, then they actually have a choice. They have opportunity to choose who they want to grow for them. If you're growing in a greenhouse, somebody might want your product more than somebody who might be growing inside of an indoor facility. And so for that reason, I guess my main question was also to get to the people who are against legalizing cannabis. Remember, we are getting solid testing done. For that reason, we actually understand what pesticides are being added. Like, there's so much tests that are actually coming out.
Question.
To get to the question, when will we actually be able to stack some of these caregivers on top of each other so that way we can actually get back to the medicinal patients who started everything?
Okay, who wants to answer that? If we have a quick answer.
The quick answer is there is directives to consider co-ops and entities like what you're talking about. This is mostly around the adult use bill. There is also action on the medical side of things. There's a bill that's alive, S117, that's sort of dealing with some of the medical issues separately. But I think that it's good points, and there's still room for a lot of discussion about that as far as the medical side goes.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ed,
Thank you, TJ.
thank you for being here.
I'll be quick. I respect all of you. I admire TJ tremendously. I'd just like to say that tobacco, nicotine, and alcohol are regulated, and they're 2 of the 3 leading causes of preventable death on Earth. Opioids. We saw in the 90s and the early 2000s a proliferation of opioids on our streets. 72,000 people died of opioid overdose in 2017. Opioids are strictly regulated. In fact, you can't get them without a doctor's prescription. I think that there's a Trojan horse in the room. I don't think, believe me, I mean this from my heart, I don't think it's intentional. I think that people are undereducated when it comes to the psychoactive, addictive potential of tetrahydrocannabinol. And that's what we're talking about. Marijuana is a delivery system for a dangerous drug, period. My question is this. We know what the use is like today in Vermont. We have statistics from treatment, from youth service, youth studies.
Yep.
My question to you is this. Once commercialization goes into effect, if 5 years from now we see a significant jump in all negative statistics related to youth and adult cannabis use, what will you do about that?
Good question. Who wants to take that?
No.
It's a good question.
I'm happy to. I still think it's the right thing to do. I think that it is, we need to deal with public health issues as
All right,
public
let's be
health issues.
respectful.
We need to deal with public safety issues as public safety issues and find the right remedies. By criminalizing a substance is not the right approach to deal with public health issues, and they should be dealt with in the public health context.
Okay. Eli Harrington, who has been a leader and an advocate on this issue for many years, has been in the forefront, helped promote this event. Eli, thank you. And you have the last word.
All right. Well,
Or question.
Yeah, question, very quickly. Thank you guys for doing this. For Erik and Kevin, when we're talking about social equity in Vermont, we've been talking, I think, a little bit more about geographic diversity. You know, considering what you guys have learned about how people travel, you know, and what this can do for certain communities who embrace it, do you think that we in Vermont, how should we think about where these businesses open and maybe prioritizing rural areas, or if it should be left totally up to the market and kind of how we should rep geographic diversity or consider that in Vermont?
Great
Thank you.
question.
I'll just jump in real quick before Kevin. Right now, Maine doesn't have a social equity program. I think that's just stems from the fact that the legislature was trying to get the Marijuana Legalization Act passed, and we quickly put together regs. That's definitely in phase 2, but I think there's a bunch of different social equity models across the country that Vermont can look to. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. You can look to Los Angeles, you can look to Colorado, you can look to Massachusetts. But I mean, as far as Maine is concerned, that's definitely a phase 2 thing, and we would be happy to learn from Vermont if that was something they would roll out.
On geographic diversity, I think you get into real trouble if you start trying to place these businesses in places and don't, but as a state. And I think you got to allow your market to handle issues like that. And in Massachusetts, our market has handled those issues. We've opened some in urban areas, we've opened some in rural areas, but to sort of start dictating where they go, I worry about that.
Okay. 10 seconds each. Final thoughts, recommendations, lessons learned. Starting with you, Dave. 10 seconds each.
10 seconds. I think what we're going to see this next session is Vermont looking at how to do this the Vermont way, which will include things like not just social equity, but environmental equity. I mean, there's a big part of our legislation that's looking at environmental justice issues and how the environment is going to be impacted by these things. So that's something to look forward to.
Great. Thank you. Laura.
This is a racial justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. It's a social justice issue. It's the right thing to do. It's a civil rights our civil rights demand it. It's long overdue. We've studied and studied and studied. We have a good proposal. We got to move forward, and we got to get this done now.
Thank you, Laura. Joe.
Regardless of where you stand on legalization or not, if there are to be businesses on the street in a state in which it's legal, that's going to mean, under current standards, a lot of cash floating out there. And from a safety standpoint for consumers everywhere, we need a federal resolve to empower financial institutions to provide services to those businesses.
Thank you, Joe. Charlotte.
This is related to social equity. If I could give one proposal for legislation, it would be to really try to earmark tax dollars to put money back and liquidity back into communities that have been harmed by criminalization of the plant. Because if there was one area that could be earmarked, and those are census tracts that can be easily identified. So put real money into providing capital to those communities.
Thank you. Kevin.
This is a highly regulated industry that is not going to change your state too much. It's not going to lead to the end of the world. Burlington's still going to be beautiful, and you know it's not going to change things that much, and you're going to have more revenue.
Erik.
And I'll just wrap up with 2 things. You can tell there's a lot of good people with valid concerns on both ends of the spectrum here, so it's so important if you do legalize it to have, again, that in-depth stakeholder communications, listen to all angles, all views, and try to get it right. And then 2, we didn't really talk about it a lot, but I think it would help with a lot of the concerns around youth use and whatnot, is the importance of thorough data collection.
Thank you. Okay. I saw them come in late, and I just want to acknowledge Representative Bob Hooper from the North End in Burlington is here. Representative Hooper, thank you for being here. Representative Jessica Brumstead from Shelburne is here as well. And we mentioned Representative Maida Townsend. I saw Representative Brian Chena from Burlington. If you can believe it, we are right on schedule. This is a conversation that provokes strong reactions from many folks, but it's a conversation that is long overdue given the legal status of where we are in Vermont. My position is that we need to act and create a regulated market. That's a responsible thing to do, and it should happen this legislative session, but this conversation will continue. But please join me in thanking the panelists for a robust conversation. Thanks for coming out.